Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
There's the place of work, but it's always temporary. The home is still the place of people to return to. The borders are interesting because one, they allow people to get home and have an identity, but at the same time, they also act like the impediments to mobility.
Everything that we're doing is participatory and deliberative. And do you want to end on with a fish joke, Siddharth?
Why fish have no borders, lives along the coast of India, and the policies that govern them. Marine conservationist Siddharth Chakravarty and anthropologist and researcher Vani Sreekanta exchanged notes on their most recent visit to West Bengal post the lifting of the lockdown. They talk about the complexities of food habits, food production, policies that govern the ecologically sensitive areas of the mangroves, coastal mechanization, gender politics, and the politics of migrating fishing workers and labor. This wide-ranging conversation mulls over the role of the researcher and the engagement, intervention, and impact on their subjects. Over to you, Siddharth.
Thanks, Lekha, for that. Hi, Vani. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Siddharth. Good to see you again.
So Vani and I were together in West Bengal about a month and a half ago from now. And you're in Bangalore, I'm in Delhi. And, we've both come back from a month of fieldwork in West Bengal. And so I thought it might be interesting to just hear how your trip to West Bengal was and maybe get some update. And I'll fill you in as well, because I was there for a whole month, but we were in different districts, different ecologies. So how was your trip to West Bengal?
How was my trip to West Bengal? So I was in the South 24 Paraganas, which is basically the Sundarbans area and the estuarial sort of where the Ganges meets the Bay of Bengal. The landscape is just stunningly beautiful and so different from anywhere else I've really traveled before. So it's gorgeous in that sense. But it's also really complicated, right? Because we were visiting some of these areas that were affected by multiple cyclones, and the Sundarbans have so much sort of climate related stuff happening there. So it was complicated. How was your trip?
It's interesting that you say that about South 24, and I'll come to that in just a minute. So I spent a lot of time in the coastal district of West Bengal. That's the Purbo Medinipur district. And I've been going back there for about 5 years now. I work with the local union there. And it was interesting because, as we'll come to later in this conversation, policy making with fisheries is really in flux. There's a huge shift coming along in that space. And so with the union members, some of the representatives, this was really a month after a year of lockdowns. I haven't traveled in a year to West Bengal, a place that I would go to at least a couple of times a month, if not, be there for longer periods of time. And so it was a moment to also just say hello to people that you've been working with, just to kind of find out how they've coped with the pandemic and the lockdown. But it was also that during this time of the lockdown, there's a lot of changes that have happened with new fisheries policies, budget allocations, etc. And so it was kind of an information exchange as what's happening as well. So it was interesting. And again, where we met last month, which was in Pothe Pratima block, where the Adivasi fishers were in tussle with the forest department, as is in most natural resource settings. I'm going back there on Monday, 4 days from now. And it's because that issue has cropped up. And there's also a lot of the mangrove that's being kind of lost to fish farming. And that's a huge shift that's come. So it was an interesting visit. I'm looking forward to going back as well. But it was strange being there as well. It wasn't this feeling of wow, I'm back in my place of work. Of course, there was that, the idea of mobility, but also to see people not being able to move out of there, people being, in spaces. And that kind of really is my next question. You met with fisherwomen, you went fishing on a fishing trip as well, if I'm not mistaken. And so how is that idea of going into a space and then the migration mobility, because climate crisis and displacement is a big part of what's going on in that region as well?
To give you a little bit of context, to tell you what exactly I was doing in the Sundarbans, right? So I'm an independent researcher. I work with an organization called the Southern Collective, and we're interested in migration in the Northern Indian Ocean region. To sort of think about, especially after sort of COVID happened and the lockdown happened, people became very aware of how many people in this country move from their traditional home. So we were sort of curious as to why people move. And along with that, what happens to people who don't move and who choose to stay back? So with that sort of background in mind, we were in the Sundarbans region because a lot of people from the Sundarbans sort of move out for various reasons. I mean, one is, of course, land loss due to climate change. Also, living conditions within the Sundarbans is difficult. There are no jobs for people. So people move out. So we went there and we were looking at that. One of the things that really does strike you is the fact that how many people are moving out of the Sundarbans. And you go to villages and they're like 60-70% of the village leaves, right? And we were sort of talking to people who stay back, and most people you see have a desire to leave. But also what was striking was we were also moving, right? My partner and I. But we didn't consider ourselves to be migrants. So we were thinking about what it means to be a migrant.
I mean, on that point, it's really interesting because just like you, I was someone who was engaged with relief work as part of a huge network of people. I think what's interesting about movement in fisheries, and the reason why I thought I would pick this point up is because I remember sometime in April last year, getting a call in Bengali from a group of fishers in Ernakulam in Kerala. And they had been just lathi charged by the police. Sorry, it was not April. It was probably just after Amphan. And the reason why that lathi charge had happened is that because part of the fisheries sector was completely disrupted and shut down. That's when it became really evident that there are a lot of people, especially from West Bengal, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, even Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, who migrate to the West Coast for work in the fishery space. On account of the fishery space being largely kind of at sea and not based on land, the kind of vulnerabilities were unique to the sector, and the response from the state was less than adequate to that. So Amphan happens in the area that you're in. People get news of like havoc and destruction and immediately want to go home. The Shramik trains are running, but Kerala to West Bengal is like a huge journey, and it's a lot of people. And so they take out a protest on the street, and the police obviously lathi charges them. And there are all these images of people with like bloodied knees. Somebody's got like blood streaming down their head. But then the good thing about the support network was that people managed to call authorities, go to the labor department, and they did get a train 2 days later to go back. And I think what that points to is what you were saying as well, is that, there's the place of work, but it's always temporary. The home is still the place of people to return to. And yeah, the people were like entering South 24 Parganas and like calling us and saying like, we've reached home. And in that moment, I think what you said about the politics of movement is, that thing that thank you for like helping us get home. I mean, migration and work in fisheries is such an intrinsic part of this sector that the thank you is just like highlighted this caste and power dynamics of like migration and who gets to help whom. And I guess in your case, or my case, what we're just talking about is who gets to research whom as well, I guess, in a way. But moving on to that, how was your experience in the West Coast? Because obviously it wasn't just people from West Bengal. There was also some fascinating things that happened in terms of like people moving. So do you have like an anecdote or story you'd like to share from the West Coast?
During COVID?
Yeah, during COVID.
So none of us sort of had any background in relief work or disaster management or anything like that. We were just like, everybody saw a gap, and so people sort of stepped in to help, which led to some really, really hairy and, insane sort of situations, because there was one particular incident which sort of stands out. There were two fishermen who were from Srikakulam who were in Kumta district, which is in the North Kannada district, right? The bus to Srikakulam was leaving from Mangalore, which is in South Kannada district, right? But because they are two separate districts, we were sort of trying to figure out how it is that these two fishermen will cross the border and get across to Mangalore from where they were going to catch their bus. So we've been talking to these guys. These guys speak only Telugu. I don't speak any Telugu. So this is somebody else who speaks Telugu in the middle, who's sort of translating all of this. So we've told these guys, okay, so tomorrow morning, we will figure out your transport. Just stay where you are. Do not leave. So they say, fine. And then at about 11:30 in the night, I get a phone call that sort of says that these guys have left. Nobody can find where these guys are, right? Now, these guys have become super stressed about their bus leaving, which is understandable, right? Because they're so far away from home. They don't know what's happening and they just want to go home. And because they're so concerned, they've decided that they're going to leave. So they get caught in the border. And we have to sort of figure out transport from the border, which is just at the gate, across. Basically, like 10 feet across. So at this point, we pick up the phone and we're trying to figure all of this out. A friend of mine gives me a contact to a man named Syed, who's going to help these guys cross. At which point, so I call this guy and he sort of asks me who, and this is at 11:30 at night, right? So this guy calls me and he's like, okay, we'll help you. My friend Amit gave you the number. Okay, all of this happens. And next day, he calls me again. He's inquiring who I am. After everything, these guys cross over. And Syed calls me and he says, Madam, I don't think I am the Syed that you were looking for. And I'm like, what do you mean? So in all of the confusion, in attempting to get people across, somehow I have managed to reach a Syed who also has a friend named Amit, who works in the same department, right? But Amit is not the same Amit and Syed's not the same Syed, right? All of these crazy things happening during COVID.
I mean, there's also the really sad side of this migration, right? Like, we know that 6 people lost their lives on the West Coast, stuck on boats. We know that about 25,000 people were stuck in Veravel, which is one of the biggest harbors on the West Coast, for like a good 3-4 weeks, after which they had like buses that they had to pay for to go home. I was based out of Goa at that point in time. And I mean, I have a story, but that points to something about like policy making in fisheries. So I'm going to quickly try and say that to kind of gesture where, you know, the oceans and fisheries kind of move. So we had a phone call from one of the trawler owners telling us that they've had 2 people on board who've had injuries. And it turns out one is from Jharkhand and the other is from Orissa. And so the Shramik special trains are only state bound. And so, you know, the Jharkhand person and the Orissa person know each other. They live about 40 kilometers apart, but they're on each side of the border, just pretty much like your story. And so it takes like special permission to the district magistrate or district collector to like get special permission that somebody from Jharkhand can board a train to Orissa. And then we had some contacts in Rourkela who we called, they helped out, got a jeep, and then this guy gets picked up and taken home. And the borders are interesting because one, they allow people to get home and have an identity, but at the same time, they also act like the impediments to mobility. And what I wanted to ask you next was about this idea that fish really don't see borders, right? And so, I mean, just for our listeners, one of the basic ways in which fisheries is managed in this country or across globally is through borders. So in India, marine fisheries, for example, each of the coastal states have 12 nautical miles, which is about 25 kilometers of water as their own. And then beyond that, up to about 340 kilometers is the exclusive economic zone. And that is under the jurisdiction of the central government. And so fishing boats will like go between coastal waters and the EEZ, or territorial waters and the EEZ. And people on those boats will go behind them as well. But they're chasing something that is in the water that at different times of the year is also going between these boundaries. And this is, of course, at the national level. You go out to the Western Indian Ocean, Pakistan, Iran, Oman, you know, all the way across Africa. Then you've got like international fleets in those waters. You've got Mauritius and Seychelles as like island states in the middle of that. And fish are just like swimming, and you've got all these boats chasing them, and then you've got borders chasing them, and then you've got people who transcended borders and are on the boats. And that forms such a central pillar of fisheries policymaking, which is the idea of borders. And I find it really hard, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, which is that what happens to people who transcend borders when we're trying to enforce borders, but also what happens to fish who swim across the oceans, but now are like, this is my fish, that's your fish. You know, these are Goa's fish, this is Karnataka's fish. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
I don't look at policy as much as I look at people. You look at policy. For me, one of the things that always stands out about this sort of border conversation is that how land-centric it is, right? And that land centricity is also a testament to policy being made by people who base their sort of identity on land, right? But if you look at coastal communities, so often coastal communities, their identity is relational to the water, to relational to the ocean, right? They, traditionally people move with schools of fish, they understand how tides move, and that forms such a central aspect of culture and their identity. And if you sort of look at what land-based policy making does to these people, is there's so much delegitimization of labor, so much sort of criminalization of movement, right? If you look at a lot of these people, they have traditionally moved, right? So if you look at the border between India and Bangladesh, it's a river that's supposed to sort of divide the two spaces. People have traditionally lived there. Their history, their culture doesn't respond to that border because that border is fairly new in some sense. Even though to us landlocked people, it seems it's been here for like hundreds of years, it's not, right? So similarly, because I've been working in the northern Indian Ocean region, if you look at it, a lot of these water spaces have been shared. If you look at, like, for instance, Sri Lanka and India, that is a very narrow strip of water there. Similar, if you move up and you look at like the south of Myanmar and Thailand, so, the south of Myanmar is way closer to Thailand than it is to the center, to Yangon. So if you think about it in that sense, and if you look at people and their mobility and their movement, you realize that historically these are people who've moved. It is the drawing of the border on the land which somehow has then delegitimized their way of life and their labor in some sense, because when these people who have traditionally moved to another country or move to another space, then they're doing something wrong, something illegal.
I know at this point in time, through some of the groups that I work with, that there's about 500 people from Gujarat in Pakistan's jails, and there's a few hundred Pakistani fishers in Gujarat's jails. It's also interesting that there's been people from Andhra Pradesh who were in Pakistan jails because they migrated across the country, they got onto a Gujarat boat, and they went across to fish in the Indus River, or the mouth of the Indus River, because it's not dammed and it's really rich waters. And Gujarat is so hyper-industrialized on the coastline that you don't have fish there anymore. And so there's this like chasing the fish, crossing borders, getting criminalized by that movement. But I mean, to add to that point, I think what we are living in today is also in an age of hyper border making, because, for example, we had a new national fisheries policy. This is a policy that's looking at setting the tone for India's fisheries policy making over the next decade, but also into the future. And the reason for that is because we have climate change, we have pressures on ecosystems, we've got extractive industries, but we also have something that kind of gestures to what you were saying, which is that, just as land-based boundary making has become ocean-based boundary making, kind of land-based extraction is now increasingly moving towards ocean-based extraction. So think about like deep sea mining, think about like mesopelagic species for like liver oil for human health. Think about, mass krill fishing from Antarctica.
Do you want to tell us what some of these words that you're using mean? A lot of people may not be aware of what they mean.
So fisheries at the moment is embedded under something known as the blue economy framework. And the blue economy is essentially kind of taking sectors that have existed in the oceans, whether that's cargo and shipping, whether that's coastal tourism, whether that's fishing, whether that's, wind energy, and kind of assimilating them in ways that they can work with each other. And so India is also massively one of the biggest proponents in the world of the blue economy framework. From the point of view of fishers, because we recently responded to the blue economy policy that the Indian government put out, the other sectors are essentially extractive sectors. So if you're talking about deep sea mining, you're essentially talking about sending robotic mining instruments about 2-3 kilometers under the surface of the ocean. And you're picking up metallic nodules that are then going to be produced for rare earth minerals or, even hydrocarbon deposits. And so you've had Bombay High and petroleum drilling and all of that, but this is the advanced, deeper kind of version of it, a highly extractive, but also capitalist and, capital intensive. It's not takes immense amount of investment to make these happen. Similarly, you've got shipping. So India's got a plan to construct like 400 harbors around India's coastline. And, there's 100 rivers which have been nationalized. So this idea that you can cheapen transport by connecting different water bodies and, alongside all your roadways also make waterways and ports and all of that. So there's a lot that the fishers and the fisheries space is seeing when it comes to some of this boundary making. And the interesting thing about boundary making is that we've had about 55 years of formal boundary making, right? So in the 1970s, you had the Convention of the Law of the Sea that gave out these boundaries that we spoke about, EZs, territorial waters. Then you had people moving across these boundaries. We've not been able to manage fisheries. Like fisheries are in a problem because it introduces all these impediments to mobility. But now you have this blue economy and you've got more border making happening. And what I feel happens with like this intensive kind of border making is that it removes people like the listeners of our conversation. What happens to someone who's sitting at home and does, let's say, an app delivery of seafood? And I think the borders act as layers of obscuring for who actually produces the food. And because you were out there in West Bengal, I'd like to ask you about that, like to talk to us about the social relations of food and the consumption of food and what happens in the middle and how can we address that? Because I think that's an important point to talk about.
It's so complex, some of these things, when you really think about it, how like policy making and how that sort of affects social relations on the ground, right? We don't really think about it. Traditionally, when we think about fishing as a sector, people tend to think of it as being extremely male dominated. Fisher goes with man, right? Like fisherman. But it's so often not the case. But the narrative is so deeply embedded in people's minds that even fish workers, right? We were talking to a lot of the women who sort of work in the industry, but when you ask them what they do, they say, oh, I don't do anything. But you're sitting next to them while they're drying fish. Women work in the industry in very many ways. In one of the ways that they work in is, and you've done some work on it, is they collect what are called shrimp seedlings, which is basically tiny shrimp, which then are sold to these large shrimp farms. Women work under extremely hazardous conditions, right? Because these are crocodile-infested waters, there river sharks. And while, so many of us hear about tiger death in the Sundarbans, we rarely hear about crocodile death of women. So these women sort of collect these things and then they sell it, but we don't think of them when we think about the fisheries as an industry. I'd like to sort of ask you a question about this, which is that, when you look at the national policy, in what way does it include women?
One of the biggest omissions from policy making, and I don't think it's restricted only to the fisheries sector, but I think is this absolute disregard for women's work, whether that's kind of reproductive domestic work in the house, which is taken as granted and natural, but especially in kind of agrarian fishing communities, there's also work in the productive field. That's, the vending, the drying, the sorting, or the keeping of recipes like seasonal food, nutritious food. I mean, all of that is work. And the policy kind of doesn't address this in a big way. So one of the demands that has been made from a lot of the women comrades is this idea that how many of us are there in this country? Because any community you go to, any location of work that you go to, there's at least 40 to 50% of the workforce that is women. The problem is that when we think of fishing, we think of the boat and being out at sea. And that is a male-dominated space, but most of the work that happens before and after is entirely women-led. And what has been happening, and I think there's somebody known as Magdalene Philomena in Kerala, and I did an interview with her a few years ago. And I think she says some things that really sum up what India's fisheries policy making has done, which is that the men have moved from manual rowing boats to motorized boats with small motors to mechanized boats. And that mobility has come. And the women have moved from bamboo baskets to aluminum baskets. And I think that captures the essence of women in fisheries. There's no census, there's no targeted intervention. There isn't this recognition within the public sphere as well as the state policymaking sphere about the value of that work. And so it's definitely, when we look at migration as well, I'm complicit in this as well. Like if I was to close my eyes and think about the migration, I'm going to think about the men who were migrating, right? Like last year, the Shramik trains evoke images of men. But, at the same time, we've seen why do women not migrate? Or if they migrate, why do they migrate to particular sectors? And I think that is something that has to be addressed in the fisheries space because it's an immensely important part of this space. And just like we're talking about like who produces food, if we keep thinking of just fishermen producing food, we again get like a lopsided idea of who's producing food. So that's the status of women in fisheries generally.
It's interesting because, maybe it's inattentional blindness, right? Like maybe they just don't see it. It has actual impact on women and their lives, right? Because one of the reasons that, women do the shrimp seedling collection is because their life, they need livelihood. And it came in because this is not a traditional occupation for women in the Sundarbans, right? It came into existence because of policy making around aquaculture and shrimp production in this country, that it formed this sector of women who then realized that they could make money this way. But now that has been banned. And in some sense, I can see scientific logic to it because when they collect these seedlings, they also destroy a lot of other fish life. But when the policy was being made, nobody thought about the fact that there's this entire group of people who now need another form of livelihood. Also, at the same time, what you saw was in the same area, there's a crocodile breeding program. The crocodile are now released into the water where women go and fish. So when policymakers think about things, I think it's important for them to think about not just the consumer and not just the economy from a very particular definition of what that is, right? The GDP growth-driven narrative, but also think about social relations on the ground, not just social relations, but people and their productivity, their livelihoods. All of these things, I think, is important to think about as well. And just to respond to you on the migration thing is that, one of the very, really cool and interesting things we found out while we were there is that a lot of women have now started migrating out of the Sundarbans. It's typical you see women move with their husbands and their families, right? But a lot of women were choosing to migrate by themselves now because now it's an option that they can do. And that also has interesting implications on ground, right? Sundarbans is a space where women get married very early. We met women who were 36, 37, who were already grandmothers. But now what has happened is that these women have the option of leaving difficult circumstances, leaving difficult marriages and domestic violence and getting out of it. So now these women who've come out, this migration has become a way for social mobility for them. And these women who have daughters will tell you that they're going to educate their daughters, that their daughters are not going to get married as soon as they hit puberty. There was one particular woman who had started traveling by air because she was making money, and she had a daughter, and she was so sure she was going to educate her daughter, that her daughter was going to have a life that of her choosing. So I think it's important when we also think about migration, because it's so pejorative and loaded, the word sometimes, that to normalize it, because historically people have migrated, people in IT migrate. So I think it's important to also look at migration as not just this people who are in difficult circumstances for migrating, but it's also a means of social mobility for people.
For sure. And I'm going to try and bring the conversation back to a couple of things that I am really interested in, but I'm very confused by as well. And I think the point is policymaking obviously responds to what society demands. We know policymaking is largely in the domain of upper caste men. If you think about the bureaucracy, if you think about things like the lateral entry into the IS, if you look at who is represented in these groups and whose policies are being made for. And therefore, I think it's important for us to think about fish very differently as well. And I grapple with this because in spite of working in this all the time for about 10 years now, I still have extreme dilemmas about what I should be eating, what food choices. So just to give an example, like you were saying, for example, if it comes to the marine fisheries sector, like Gujarat's the giant in India, followed by Tamil Nadu. But at the same time, Gujarat's fishing fleet is entirely trawlers, and Tamil Nadu is purse seiners. At the same time, they have this indigenous fleet that goes out south of Diego Suarez and catches tuna and brings it back. Then you have Andhra Pradesh, which between the kind of Krishna and Godavari rivers has blossomed into one of the world's like most productive shrimp growing regions. These are all like former rice plants and estuarine regions where they're growing this like Pacific white shrimp. It's like a shrimp from Mexico that came to India in 2009. And it's been grown and it's $1 billion industry. Then you've got, places like UP becoming big growers or like of freshwater fish, like the rohus and the katlas and the mrigals. Then you've got Kashmir and the Himalayan states where now there's like salmon and trout and halibut and all of these things coming in. And so these are species which are commercially important, but they're also responding to the urban consumer, right? Like the pomfret fry, the shrimp kind of starters, the fish curry. And I used to work in conservation and I was vegan for 6 years. And then I went to West Bengal for a training and I stopped being vegan the first day. It just seemed like, as an upper caste man in this country, kind of thinking of veganism as saving the world is something that just didn't agree with my politics. You are a vegetarian who was in West Bengal for a whole month. And so maybe like as we wind down to talking about this, there's so much to fish, right? Like we've just spoken a little bit about like borders, migration, a little bit of policy making. We know fisheries as a space is complicated. We know that a lot of the women's work is unrecognized. We know there's a lot of migration. We also know there's a huge ecological kind of crisis in it, whether that's the rivers, whether that's the ocean space, whether that's intensive farming, just like green revolution technologies, blue revolution technologies also are intensive and have led to like a lot of ecological decline. So what does food choices or ethical choices in connection to what we were speaking about earlier, which is people or people who grow food, how would that look? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
This whole thing about my vegetarian sort of food choices, I've sort of sat with it for such a long time because it's, first of all, when I was in West Bengal, people could simply not believe that I was vegetarian because I'm not squeamish in any way. I will smell dry fish and I'm cool with it. So people be like, you're not Niramish. This is not true. But there was this kid who was really pissed with me because before his family found out that I was Niramish, they were going to slaughter a chicken and now there was no chicken for him. But my vegetarianism really, it's so complicated and I've tried to unpack this for a bit because it stems from growing up in an upper caste vegetarian household, right? But at the same time, I discovered that I don't have a palate for it. I don't enjoy the taste of meat. But I'm perfectly happy, even as somebody who has worked in conservation for a while, I'm perfectly okay with people eating what they produce, Sunita Narain did a really interesting piece on this that I really recommend people go and read. This idea of consumption and meat and that being connected to planetary harm is also extremely, you need to think about this in economies of scale, right? Like in the West, people consume an enormous amount of meat. So outside of the urban consumer, if you look at an average Indian, they don't consume a lot of that kind of meat, right? The harm in many sense comes from the supply chain of fish rather than, people who are just fishing in their pond and eating. So I think one of the things that I've become more comfortable with and I sort of invite people to do is to sort of sit with complexity and not look for quick answers. Think about things at a more systems level. Think about things in its complexity and you will find an ethical choice that you can make that takes into account all of these complexities and doesn't boil down to just greenwash.
For sure. I identify with that feeling a lot. I think the idea of shifts in food from one form to another don't necessarily imply sustainability. I think the idea, and that's where it's important to think about the people who grow food and at least try and kind of understand where food comes from. Like, I don't believe consumers through eco-labels or through like knowledge will ever be able to have enough information because it's just too much. That shouldn't be the role of the consumer as well. But I think a consciousness across people about wanting to be more intrigued and amazed as well, right? Like from where food comes from. I think that has the chance to influence how we think about food, about the people who produce food, about the power relations between food. And I'm interested in power, especially in India, gender and caste power. And so merely shifting from let's say, one form of meat to another, or from meat to vegetarian, or from fish to vegetarianism, still doesn't deal with the problem of, let's say, Dalit labor, still doesn't deal with like the zamindars or the informal money lending economy, doesn't deal with bureaucracy and upper caste ideas of modernity and growth. So I think it's very important that that kind of process goes alongside with food choices as well. And I think it's really important that we do this in the environmental debate, because so much of the environmental debate and fisheries is intrinsically, especially the oceans part of it. And it's connected because, okay, we've got an environmental decline. We've got the oceans, which are warming. We've got, sea level rise. We've got massive extinction. And therefore, it means that we've got to release pressure from the oceans and move to farming fish on land. So almost all fish that we eat is kind of connected to the environmental kind of debate. And there's a huge urgency to address the environmental debate. And very often complexity or sitting with discomfort, you lose out on that because you have to respond. And I think it's really important to kind of think about the fact that, one, it's not individual choices. These are big system structural kind of changes, and we need to think about them. But at the same time, it's also that when you sit with complexity, actually some really interesting ideas emerge from it. It's not that it blurs you into inaction for years and years. I think it helps you with multiple things. And that's what I think about as food as well. And at the same time, like a disclaimer, it's not as easy as one thinks it is. And I think it's important to remember that most big global problems are complex problems, and fisheries is one of them. And I think learning about the people and the environments and the geographies of where food comes from, I think has a really good way to move towards thinking about fish and food and people.
I completely agree. One of the reasons I encourage everybody to sit with discomfort and sort of get comfortable with complexity is because one of the things that happens is that when you start looking at the broader picture, you start seeing how often a narrative is fed to you, right? This sustainability debate, for instance, or the consumer's right to choose, and simplifying that just to like market choices, erases certain things. Like, for instance, say today you decide that tuna is bad and everybody, stops eating tuna. As a market, sure, you're pushing, you have power, definitely, and you should use that power. But that also, because you haven't thought about social relations and the complexity of food production, is now affects a lot of people in their livelihoods that don't have the ability to spin midways and then get another job somewhere in another sector, right? So when you really think about these large problems, and the reason why we should become comfortable with sitting with discomfort is it's going to, to solve a lot of these problems, it's going to take all of us all the time in some sense.
This idea of who is making policies for whom, and I think it's a really important reflexive moment for us as well, is like who is researching whom, who's speaking on the podcast on behalf of whom or over whom. And I think it's important to also acknowledge that kind of discomfort with all of this. But, one of the strange things that has happened over the last few years is that policy making has moved into an online email English version-based public comments process. And so the national fisheries policy, the blue economy policy, the mariculture, like all of these policies are just online with an email address that says, send in your comments by so-and-so date at so-and-so email address. And it's just in English. It happened with the environmental impact assessment for sure. And that really, fisheries is in all the states. It's in like multiple regional languages. Almost every water body in this country has a fisher on it. The smallest seasonal pond that forms for a few weeks to the ocean, which is like omnipresent and expansive. There's fishers across all of that in the mountains, in the reservoirs, everywhere. And so I feel like one of the things that we also need to do is that when we think about policy or shifts, it's like, are the people who are the first engagers with this policy really at the center of the policy or not? And I think that as a consumer as well is a really good and important, simple point to start thinking about, which is to say, if the policy says this is for the lives and livelihoods of the fish and fish farmers of this country, and there's 3 crore of them, that's a significant number of people. And so find groups, there's unions, collectives, little groups everywhere that are dealing with things, try and engage with them, look up. I think that's really interesting to then do as well, because a lot of these groups I know say what's going to happen to us if the larger public doesn't look at the oceans or fish or food from our perspective. we get further marginalized and pushed to the side. And so for me, I think that's just a nice point to end on from my side. And I'll leave you with I'll let you have any final thoughts, which is like, let's decenter ourselves in the food sustainability debate as well and try and refocus it on someone else for whom that crisis has been manifesting for a long time. It's only now that it's come to us, but it's important not to overtake that space.
I completely agree. When we were, as researchers, you're sort of constantly in a space where you are an agent, if not a gatekeeper, right? Like you're going into spaces, you're collecting people's stories, and then the pressure's on you to sort of adequately represent that. And one of the ways I think that more and more we should try and do is to ask ourselves, how is it that my research is representative? Is it just that I'm sitting with somebody and interviewing them and then writing up a paper? That's going to benefit nobody other than me in some sense, right? But also to ask ourselves, what are the different ways in which my research can be representative and participatory, right? Think of ways by which you can also get out a little bit, right? Like think of ways in which you're empowering people in the knowledge production and knowledge system cycle. Some of the work that we do at the Southern Collective, it's something that we think about. And I would sort of encourage people who sort of are viewers who, think about, when people say this is scientifically backed, I hope that they then engage with that question as to who's produced this knowledge, on behalf of whom.
The Southern Collective is obviously something that's a new kind of intervention to challenge some of the things that we've been speaking about.
So we tweet at South Collect. You can also contact me or Siddharth. I tweet at Vani Sreekanta.
I'm at Ocean Banter on across platforms. So
you can tweet at us if you feel like engaging with us. We are a collective of interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder space, which includes both researchers, policy, and civil society organizations, but also impacted communities and people who work with them. And we think about stuff like migration, transboundary resources, non-humans like tuna and that sort of stuff. One of the things that's really important to us is to sort of make sure that everything that we're doing is participatory and deliberative. And do you want to end on with a fish joke, Siddharth?
I think you should totally give us a fish joke and then we'll end.
I'm going to give you a fish joke now. What does a fish say when it runs into a brick wall?
Give us the answer.
Come on. It says, oh, damn.
On that note, we should really be concerned about dams as well, because, there's a lot happening on the rivers with dams, the Narmada and the kind of Hooghly, Farakka Barrage being perfect examples.
And all over the Northeast and Kashmir space,
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I think it was really interesting to go from West Bengal across, following people's migrations across borders out to sea, following fish as well. And then I think thinking about food, I think that's a very important point for us. Personally, both of us also, I think a lot about food and policy and people. So I think it was interesting to bring that all in. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Siddharth, for inviting me. And thank you, BIC, for having us. This was so lovely.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.